ready for round two now. You'll be pleased to know round two is a lot easier to take on board, and it's very rewarding because now we're in the payoff. We are now going to deliver the payoff of the chronology, of the reworking of the biblical timeline in relationship to Egypt. So I'm going to go straight on to the visuals. We've got quite a bit to get through, and the idea is we're going to present different sections, stop for a little while, have a chat about it, then go back to the next section and work our way through so that we get questions and discussions in while we still can remember the subject material, okay? And then, of course, you're going to have a chance later on to have some Q&A. So if we can start off with the visuals. As you can see, the important thing on this screen is the question mark down there. It's not a statement, it's a question. Whether or not this Exodus is mythological, is it Harry Potter, or is it something more than Harry Potter? Do you, the basis of your faith and religion, is it a fairy tale, or is it something very real, very historical? Now, as an archaeologist and a historian, I can't deal with miracles. I can only give you the historical elements of the story. And that's what I'm going to do. And that's the framework upon which and the foundation upon which you base your faith. And as Tim said, it's all about reason. You cannot have a book that is the basis of everything you believe if you think that is not true, if that's a fairy story. That foundation there is everything. So as an agnostic, as a historian, I look at this as a historical text. I do not dismiss it as a fairy story just because it's called the Bible. I treat it like any other ancient text, whether it be Herodotus, whether it be a text of Ramesses II talking about the Battle of Kadesh. It's a history book. Primarily, it's a history book upon which the faith is based. And that's the way I approach it. So, we've got a question mark down there, and I'm going to be able to take that question mark off and dismiss the myth and leave us with history. And we'll do that now with this new chronology that we've devised, so we have a completely new canvas to work with. We can now construct the story of the Bible in relationship to Egypt, in relationship to the archaeology, because we haven't got that terrible Shishak blunder anymore. Okay? So let's go. First of all, we're going to deal with the academic approach to this from the last 35 years or so, what we call the myth. This myth has evolved from scholarship, people looking at the material from an archaeological perspective, also from a theological perspective and a historical perspective. And the conclusion that most of these academics have come to is it's a history that never happened. It's an invention of the priests of later times, creating this pious myth in order to give somebody a foundation for their nation and their belief systems. Okay? But we're going to show that wrong. So you're going to get a few negatives here, and then we'll move on to the really positive stuff. Okay? So, the basis upon the whole thing is, of course, this gentleman here. We all know him, Yul-Brynner, as Ramesses II, and his buddy, his best mate, Charlton Heston. This is what we grow up with. We've grown up with it for the last century, virtually, since the cinema world began with the first black and white version of Cecil B. DeMille's film. But of course, he based the whole thing on what he was told by scholarship, which was that Ramesses II was the pharaoh of the Exodus and the oppression, and that Moses lived in the time of the 19th dynasty, which is when Ramesses was obviously reigning. And that was what we call the Ramesses Exodus theory. Now, a lot of conservative evangelical scholars would say, well, that can't be right, because if we look at the date, Ramesses II and Moses, in this model, places the Exodus around 1250 BC. But that's not what the Bible says. The Bible has a different date, roughly 200 years earlier. And yet scholars have gone for this date simply because of the connection, the city of Ramses, which the Israelites built, that you find in the first few lines of the book of Exodus. And on that basis alone and nothing else, we have a 1250 BC date for the Exodus in scholarship. As I say, some scholars go for 1450 BC, which places the same event in the 18th dynasty, in the middle of the 18th dynasty, okay? So the question is, was this really when it happened? I would say no. And most of the scholars you're going to see here also say no. Not because they want to prefer the 18th dynasty date, because they didn't think it happened at all. Certainly not in the time of Ramesses. Now, the basis for this argument, this negative argument, is this place, Jericho. Joshua then destroyed Jericho around 1210 BC, which is 40 years after 1250 and the Exodus. That's the rough date, approximate date that people place the destruction of Jericho. Now, I'm going to start giving you a few quotes now. Somebody you probably never heard of called John McCarthy. He was one of the Beirut hostages, a British newspaper man who went to Beirut and was captured by Hezbollah and imprisoned along with American hostages and Terry Waite. And while he was in his dungeon for many years, the only book he had to read was the Bible. And he sat there in the dark trying to read this book over and over again. And he wasn't a religious man, but it's the only book he had to read. And he got deeply involved in the story. And when he was released, he decided what he was going to do is find a historian, John Sturgis, and he's going to write a book about his thoughts about the biblical story. And because he was a newspaper man, he went off and interviewed lots of scholars and archaeologists working in Israel and other parts of Egypt, trying to get an idea from them what they thought happened in the Bible stories. And he made a documentary series called It Ain't Necessarily So. You know the Porgy and Bess folk opera, where you get, I think its name was Sporting Life, played by Sammy Davis Jr., and he did this song called It Ain't Necessarily So, the things that you're liable to read in the Bible, it ain't necessarily so. And he took that title for a good reason, because every single scholar he went to, every single archaeologist said, the Bible isn't true. It ain't necessarily so. So here's a quote from John McCarthy. When the site at Jericho was reworked in the 1950s by Kathleen Kenyon, it was discovered that the walls had fallen down long before Joshua and his people were supposed to have arrived, and that at that time, Jericho was almost certainly unoccupied. The conquest of the Promised Land by the children of Israel began to evaporate into thin, hazy air. Every single person he talked to said there was no Jericho at the time of Ramesses II. And that is true. That is absolutely true. So, let's move on. If we now see where the problem lies, I'm going to use this graphic to do that. Now, it looks fairly simple at the moment, but it's going to get quite complicated in a second, so we're going to have some archaeology here. These phases that you see here are archaeological phases. LB is late Bronze or late Bronze Age, and then Iron Age, Iron Age. So you have the late Bronze 2A, followed by the late Bronze 2B, and then the Iron Age begins, working towards the present. And here are your conventional datings for these eras. So for instance, the end of the late Bronze Age comes in about 1250, between 1250 and 1200. Okay? Already you should be thinking this is the time of the Exodus, according to the conventional scheme. Let's now put in the biblical events. So in the late Bronze 2A we have part of the Sojourn, which is also earlier. Then in the late Bronze 2B, this is where we place Moses and the Exodus. And then we have the Judges period in two phases, going through towards the united monarchy of Saul, David, and Solomon. Now, if I put in the Egyptian data to match that, we end up with Akhenaten and Tutankhamun down here, then the famous Ramesses II of the 19th dynasty as a contemporary of Moses in the late Bronze Age, and then Ramesses III in the 20th dynasty and on back into the third intermediate period. This is the period that I've been specializing in. So you begin to see the relationships between the biblical story, the archaeology, and the Egyptian history. This is the conventional scheme. This is not the new scheme that we've been developing. This is the way that scholars see it conventionally. So now you can see there's one column I haven't filled in yet, and that is Jericho. Now see what happens to Jericho. Well, first of all, we find a large farm or house in the late Bronze 2A that was excavated. It's called the Middle Building by archaeologists because it falls in the middle of a gap. It's probably was occupied for about 20 years maximum by no more than a dozen people, but the rest of the site basically was completely unwalled and an abandoned ruin. And then in the Iron Age 1B, a new town is founded. This town thrives and continues on afterwards. And I'll explain a little bit about what that town is later. But then, just at the time when we have Moses and the Exodus, and therefore Joshua and the conquest, we have a huge black hole. There is nothing at Jericho between this house and that town. And that's where the conquest is placed. Now do you see why scholars and archaeologists say that it's impossible for the Bible to be true? Because Joshua there and Jericho just do not match. So Bill Deaver, who's a biblical archaeologist from the USA, he said this about Jericho. Joshua destroyed a city that wasn't even there. And this is the mantra that we have now. And it's the starting point for this whole negativity that we see from scholarship. Zeev Herzog is a professor of history and archaeology in Israel, a famous one. He created a furore of debate and argument amongst the press in Israel when he announced that the Exodus is a history that never happened. So you have Israeli archaeologists and historians, you have American archaeologists, you have British archaeologists, all saying the same thing. The Bible is a fiction because Jericho didn't exist at the time when Joshua was supposed to have been there. So, an Exodus in the 19th dynasty, that is looking extremely unlikely. There was no Exodus at the time of Ramesses II. Now, that is a truth. That is a fact. I'm not disputing that. Nobody's disputing that. That's what archaeology tells us happened. Okay? So we have to explain it. We can either say the Bible is a fairy story, or we have to be sensible about this and look for an alternative reasoning. And that's what I did. Let's look at what Finkelstein, who is the doyen of Israeli archaeology, has to say about early Israel. That's the formation of the state after the so-called conquest, which he doesn't believe in. There was no mass exodus from Egypt. There was no violent conquest of Canaan. Something clearly doesn't add up when the biblical account, the archaeological evidence, and the Egyptian records are placed side by side. Again, this is absolutely true. But what they do is they simply reject the Bible and take everything on board as being factual. They take the Egyptian records to be true, they take the archaeological evidence to be true, and their interpretation of it. So the thing that gets put in the dustbin is that book. And when we see, and this is in the film, you'll see this later on, this remarkable interview between David Wolpe and Michael Medved. This is David Wolpe on this side. Your number one rabbi in the United States. This is what he had to say in the interview, and I find this quite extraordinary. Medved asked him, in 2001, Rabbi Wolpe, he created a national furore when his Passover sermon challenged the historical reality of the Exodus. Rabbi Wolpe, what did you say? And this was a response. The Exodus certainly didn't happen the way that the Bible depicted it, assuming that it was a historical event of any description. I think that if you look at it scientifically, it's virtually indefensible to make the Bible's case. Remember, this is a rabbi speaking. What part of the Torah would you grant to be based upon historical reality? The reply, I can't tell you. I don't know. I don't know, and although it may irk people, I don't care. So there's a rabbi telling his congregation that it doesn't matter if the Bible isn't true. Just accept the moral teachings without the history. You don't need the foundation. The foundation is not important. So, the academic conclusion to all this, and I've only given you a small set of highlights because there are a lot more quotes that I could have put in there. As there is no archaeological evidence to confirm or even support the stories of the Old Testament, it's logical to conclude that the Bible is a work of fiction. That is the academic position that we're in at the moment. And now we try to explain that visually with Tim's wonderful wall of time from the movie, which you'll see later. He has the animated. I can't animate it here. But we have according to Tim, he's divided up this whole era from the beginning of the sojourn with the arrival, the multiplication, the slavery, the judgment, the exodus and the conquest. That's the pattern that we're looking at. And we have to try and find out where that pattern really works, those 6 steps. And if you look at it in the 19th dynasty we've been talking about, here's your pattern here. But in this period, as we've seen from the archaeologist's point of view, there is no match. There is no correspondence in that period. Though you may notice back here, there does seem to be something going on, which we're going to get to later. And then those scholars who want to have the 1450 BC date, the date that's actually in the Bible, the date from the time of the construction of the temple back 480 years, you get to this period of around 1450 BC, and we find ourselves now in the 18th dynasty of the New Kingdom, and again we have an exodus with nothing corresponding in the archaeological record in Egypt. And ironically, these 2 pharaohs are now, in those 2 models, the pharaohs of the Exodus. Ramesses II in 1250 and Pharaoh Thutmose III in 1450 BC. They happen to be the 2 most powerful, influential, and richest pharaohs in the entire New Kingdom history of Egypt. How likely is it, therefore, that in the most stable periods of Egyptian history, the Israelites destroyed the country, left it in complete destruction and abandonment, went off to conquer the Promised Land without the Egyptians making any effort to stop them? There is no sign at all in those 2 reigns of a crumbling of the Egyptian state. There is absolutely no sign in these 2 reigns of any sort of loss of control in Palestine, in Syria, in Canaan, for the window of opportunity for the Israelites to come in under Joshua and actually conquer the place. It just doesn't work. Neither case works. So here we come with the what if. My question was then very simple. What if scholars have been looking in the right places for the Bible stories, but in entirely the wrong time? That was the simple and obvious question to be asked, which nobody had actually asked. Nobody had bothered to ask that question. So if we now look at Jericho, and we look at it in this light, what if we find the Jericho that was destroyed and work from there? If the Bible tells us Joshua destroyed Jericho and is abandoned for centuries, why didn't we look for that Jericho? Instead of saying, oh, well, it's not possible Jericho wasn't there, let's find the city of Jericho that was destroyed. Now, we know where Jericho is, Tel Es Sultan. We always know where the location is. There's no question about the identity of the place. So here we are looking at the Iron Age town that we saw earlier on, the Dark Age, and down here we have the Middle Bronze Age city, a flourishing, powerful city with high walls. So what we're going to do is we're going to start to investigate this city, because this city's walls collapsed. It was heavily burnt and abandoned for centuries, exactly like the Joshua story. And then we have this 600-year gap until the refounding of the city in the time of Ahab and Omri. If you remember the story of Hiel, who comes and founds the rebuilt city of Jericho on the bodies of his 2 sons, one under the gates and the other under the foundations. So the question is, was this city the one that Joshua destroyed? The Middle Bronze 2B city? And if that's the case, then we have to put the conquest right at the point where the city is destroyed, and therefore the Exodus 40 years earlier in this Middle Bronze Age period. So we've moved ourselves from the Late Bronze Age, where the conventional dating is, and we've moved the whole story into the Middle Bronze Age, a whole era earlier. And that's where we're going to concentrate later on today, on the conquest, and before that the Exodus, and before that the sojourn. So let's start with the sojourn. We're going to work forward in time now, from the arrival of the Israelites in Egypt through to the Exodus and beyond. And it starts with prosperity, followed by slavery. You know the story. Joseph comes into Egypt as a slave. He rises to the ranks. He helps to explain Pharaoh's dreams for him. He becomes the highest official in the land. His family are brought in from Canaan during the famine period, and they are given the best part of Egypt to live in. They prosper and multiply, and then they're suddenly plunged into slavery. And then on comes Moses and the Exodus after that. But let's first of all look at the beginnings of all this. Just to recap where we are then, we're in now the Middle Bronze Age. Middle Bronze 1, Middle Bronze 2A, Middle Bronze 2B, that's the archaeology. In Egypt, this is the 12th dynasty, the 13th dynasty, and something called the Hyksos period, which I'll deal with in a moment. So, in this new timeline, Jericho was destroyed during the Middle Bronze 2B. We're not quite sure where in this phase, but it's somewhere in this period here. And then in the 12th dynasty, here we have the arrival of the Israelites. This is how it works with the biblical chronology in relationship to archaeology. And you'll notice something very interesting. We have one phase called Middle Bronze 2A, which is actually matching exactly with the Israelite sojourn in Egypt, and then we have the conquest 40 years later. So the Exodus takes place in the transition between Middle Bronze 2A and Middle Bronze 2B. And over here, at the end of the 13th dynasty, followed by the Hyksos period. Now the Hyksos were invaders. They came into Egypt and they took it over and they dominated it for a couple of centuries. The Egyptian pharaohs were killed and slaughtered, their families were murdered, the women were put into slavery, and the women were actually buried along with the warriors who died. They buried the Egyptian female slaves next to them. They were brutal people. This is Egypt's punishment after the Exodus. This. So here is the arrival, here is the prospering, here is the slavery, here is the Exodus, and off to the promised land and the conquest of Jericho.
What you're saying is that the pattern of evidence was seeing that which the film is going to be, explaining, and is that in this Middle Bronze Age 1 time period, the 12th dynasty, is when you saw it, and others, that there was this influx coming into
brand new people coming into the Eastern Delta.
And they were allowed to be there. What BTEC told me.
Yeah, exactly. They were under the invite of the Pharaoh, just like in the Bible.
So when I was talking with Manfred BTEC, he said to me that these people were given an invitation to be here. In other words, it looked as if they were guests and allowed to settle in that land, matching, once again, the story, the pattern of the story.
And there's your quote. Joseph then settled his father and brothers, giving them the land holdings in Egypt in the very best part of the country, which at this particular point in Genesis it says the region of Ramesses. Other times it says Goshen. Just as Pharaoh had ordered. Pharaoh had given them permission to settle in the best part of Egypt, the richest and luscious part. And here it is. This is the land of Goshen. Photographed from the Austrian excavation dig house of Manfred BTEC, looking out on the fields where the Israelites lived.
And that was then when I started to realize that we were looking for patterns of evidence. Let's start over and say, where does the pattern begin? And that began, for me as a filmmaker, the approach to take. And I could see that was the scientific approach. Mm-hmm. And so once we said, let's be free of the dating question, let's just look for the pattern, because of all the information that you know now about the questions about dating. Mm-hmm. So that gave us the freedom to look for the pattern.
Sure. So let's actually follow this up now, just so you know where Goshen is. It's right there. So it's in the Eastern Delta. It's the nearest part of the fertile delta to Israel and Canaan. Okay? It's on the border of Egypt, effectively, and any Asiatics or Semites coming into Egypt would have settled in the nearest part to their own homeland. That's the area they were given. So what is this land of Goshen that later is called the land of Ramesses? Well, it's located in the Eastern Delta, as we've seen. It's in the nome the Egyptians call Gesem, okay, which is biblical Goshen. And it's by what we call the Pelusiac branch of the River Nile. That's the most furthest east branch of the River Nile. It's on the eastern side of the Pelusiac branch of the River Nile, at a place in this time now, in the Middle Bronze Age, which was known as Avaris. And it later became Pyramesse. The city was renamed at the time of Ramesses II, Pyramesse. And I suppose you want to ask that question now. Well, how did that happen? How come the Bible refers to it as Ramses? Well, it's a little bit like the Dutch founding New York. Seems reasonable to you, that statement, doesn't it? Did they found New York?
No.
They founded New Amsterdam. But we're perfectly happy with the idea of them found in New York. Or the Roman 6th Legion comes into England and builds a garrison in the city of York, which New York's named after. And you'll see that in your encyclopedias. But the Romans didn't establish their garrison in York. They founded a garrison in Eboracum, which is what the Romans called it. It was only when the Vikings came along and renamed it Jorvik that we get the name York. But you'll read an encyclopedia that says the 6th Legion founded a garrison at York. So the same thing going on here.
And the thing that we try to show in the film is that underneath the city of Ramesses is this older city of Ars. And so the challenge is that the name Ramesses actually is the name of a pharaoh, it's the name of a time period, and it's the name of a city that was built at a particular time.
The royal city of the king. He founded this city of Ramses, which you're going to see now, on top of Avaris, the older city. So what the Bible's telling you isn't so much what they built as where they built. So the Israelites built a city at the place where the audience of the time reading the Bible would know to be Ramses, because they did know Ramesses. Ramesses was very famous, the city. They wouldn't have known the ancient name for it, which was Avaris. So here, we're looking down on the very area we're talking about. And this thing here is what we call a tell, or a ruin mound. In fact, it occupied this entire area, but what happened was the farmers, the fellahin in this area, had been ploughing these fields and digging out the ancient site over the centuries, leaving only this last tiny bit of it left here. So this entire area was developed. And another city was found here underneath Cantia. So if I show you now the landscape as it was in ancient times, they used drill cores, about 850 drill cores, to establish that the river, Pelusiac River, the Nile, flowed through here one time. And it divided into two. So the original name of the town, or the village here, was Rowati, which means the mouth of the two ways, where the river Nile split in two, went off to the Mediterranean. And it's on these turtlebacks here, these islands, that they established the first settlement. And in the inundation season, of course, all this area would be flooded except for these sand islands that you see here. So they built the village on top of those. So we're in the eastern side, and I'll now show you the settlements. So Avaris, the ancient city, was built predominantly on this island and in this area down here. And later Ramesses, the focus of Ramesses, the city of Ramesses, was here with a royal palace. However, the southern district of Ramesses was built on top of Avaris. So the whole thing was one massive city in the 19th dynasty. But the Israelite city is this one, the earlier one, the Middle Bronze Age one. And here it is. And this is one of the photographs of the excavations a few years ago now, which have collapsed, as you see, and overgrown in this particular part on the main tell. Here's the village of Tel Edaba, which is the name that Tim mentioned earlier. Tel Edaba means the mound of the hyena, and this is the village basically which sits on top of the ancient Israelite city. That's what it looked like when it was being excavated in the 1960s, this particular part here, and you can see them digging down and revealing all the important archaeology under this tell. And we managed to reconstruct the actual complex here and the buildings, etc., as we found them from archaeology, from the reports. What you have is the Egyptian enclave with nicely plastered houses. You have the royal palace and the private temple of the king facing the Pelusiac branch of the Nile, and then behind it this massive Semitic poor area where the Semites lived in this area. They also lived across the river here, but we didn't reconstruct that. But this was the main area of the town, and it turned out to be one of the biggest cities in the ancient world. It was actually more than 1 mile by 1 mile square in terms of its size. Huge population. So, the Middle Bronze II city of Avaris, the Middle Bronze Age city, this is the only real candidate for the era and location of the Israelite sojourn as handed down in the biblical tradition. There is no other one. This is when we have the large population of Semites. These people, as you'll see in a little while, live there for a while, they expand, they become slaves. There's some terrible disaster hits the place, they all leave. 40 years later, Jericho's destroyed. If we look at the excavations, I'll now show you what the Israelites of that time looked like. Here they are, the Austrians are excavating. You'll notice that they're digging down less than a couple of feet before they reach the levels, because the farmers have ploughed the rest away above, leaving us just the foundations. Here's a typical pair of Israelite graves. Because there are no stones in this area, because it's the delta, they use mud bricks to build their graves, and they are pits in the ground lined with bricks with a vaulted ceiling. This has been dug away, but this would have been an arch ceiling running across the entire grave here. This one has been dug out, so this one is still to be excavated. This one is open, and I'm going to show you the interior of one of these graves now. You'll notice that the body is lying on its side. Now, Egyptians are not buried on their sides, they're buried on their backs, with their hands down like that. And if you're a pharaoh, like that. And if you're a queen, like that. Okay? But an ordinary person would be buried on his back, usually in a coffin. This guy is on his side with his knees up in what we call the semi-fetal position. This is very much a trait of Semitic peoples from Canaan. This is how they buried the dead. And then along with the dead, they have pottery, which tells of the date, archaeological date of the burial. Now, some of the wealthier tombs had remarkable things in, like, for instance, this magnificent bronze, what we call duckbill axe head. So it's like a duckbill axe because it's like the beak of a duck. It's also called a fenestrated axe because it has these two holes here. But this is a very typical Middle Bronze 2A axe or weapon. And of course we have typical Canaanite pottery. This is a storage jar from the Middle Bronze 2A. So this is how we date when this burial took place, or when these burials took place. Another thing we find a lot of is tiny little vessels called tel al-Yahudiya ware, about the size, that size, which is usually for ointments, perfumes, etc., for the ladies. It's typical only of this period. Now, if I show you a waterlogged grave here, this is one from a garden tomb that you're going to see in a little while. You see this object here? That is actually a duckbill axe which has not been cleaned up. And this thing, I'm just going to restore that for you. When the archaeologists removed that from the grave and cleaned it up, it turned out to be a magnificent bronze belt. Now this is what a chieftain would wear. With his long gown on, he would have this magnificent bronze belt around here, and he'd be wearing his dagger, his really important dagger, to show his status, his wealth, his power amongst the tribe. And these are the daggers that were found in these graves. Beautiful bronze ribbing, ivory handles, gold rivets to hold the framework together. This is high status material. This is not cheap rubbish. This is really top class Canaanite, Semitic weaponry. And let me just put a little quote in from the Bible. Simeon and Levi are brothers. Their daggers are vicious weapons. So even in the Bible, we hear reference to these weapons, these daggers being worn by tribal chieftains, the sons of Jacob. And now, in some of these high status burials of these chieftain figures, the bodies were brought to the grave on a truck, a cart, dragged by two donkeys, and then a pit was dug in front of the graves, and the throats of the donkeys were slit, and they were buried in front of the grave. Now that is again typically from Canaan, from Israel, later Israel. We have this type of burial. But what's important is, along with the two donkeys were two sheep placed in their sacrificial sheep. And the bone analysis by the experts on this has demonstrated that these sheep were from North Syria. They are actually the long-haired Syrian variety, which is exactly where the patriarchs came from. And this is the first time we see them in Egypt. We don't have the sheep, this type of sheep, in Egypt until this era. And we all know that the Israelites were shepherds.
I think that that's one of the things that always continued to be supportive of the story. The pattern was matching once again, the pattern, the pattern, the pattern. And I think that it wasn't just, I was surprised by some of the other, people who've looked in this. They haven't really thought much about the verses and looked at it and said, well, what are the clues you would look for?
Mm-hmm.
And once again, the pattern, when you start to add up all the pieces, the pattern really started to make sense to me. Because I didn't want to make a film that was off track. I was trying to understand something that was valid, that was legitimate. And we had numerous other scholars that have looked at this and said, yes, this matches the story of the time.
But you asked Beat the question, what were these people like? And he told you they were shepherds.
Yes.
And yet he still didn't identify them as the Israelites.
Right. He called, did he say proto-Israelites?
Well, no, he doesn't use that word. Oh, no, he wouldn't use that word. So they can't see the wood for the trees. It's essentially what he's saying. Mm-hmm. Now, if I'll move on because we're getting a little bit time compressed here. So let's move on to Joseph, shall we? This is the historical events behind the tradition of the sojourn. Well, just before the time when I placed Joseph's arrival, we start to see Semites coming into Egypt. This is from Beni Hassan, and they are wearing, yes, you've got it, multicolored coats. This is the only time in Egyptian history we have visual art of Semitic peoples entering Egypt wearing this type of colored coat. In the New Kingdom, when you have the standard chronology, they wear white coats with trim on their sleeves and around their necks. They don't wear multicolored coats. And here is the leader of the brigade coming in, the 37 people, I would call them Midianites. His name is Abishah, and he's called a Hyksos, or a ruler of the foreign countries, and he's got a fabulous coat, much better than the rest of the men of the tribe. So status is all important here. You get the best coat if you're the leader. This is the time of two pharaohs, Senusret III and Amenemhat III, who were co-regents. This is the father, this is the son. What's noticed about these two is how miserable they are. These are the only two pharaohs in Egyptian history which look like this. Look at the way the mouth is turned down. Look at the furrows here. Look how the ears are turned, big ears are turned around at right angles. Now, in visual art, an art historian will tell you that what this reflects is concern on the part of the pharaoh for his people. It's not smiley, smiley pharaohs here. This is pharaohs who are worried, who are concerned for Egypt, showing concern for it, and it's the only time we see this. And there's a reason for it. This is the Fayum Basin, which we'll come back to in a minute, Great Lake, Birkat Karun. But this is a quote from the Bible. Genesis 41, 17-21. So Pharaoh told Joseph, "In my dream there I was standing on the bank of the river Nile, when 7 fat cows, fat and sleek, came up out of the Nile and began to feed amongst the rushes. And then 7 more cows came up behind them, starved, very wretched and lean. I have never seen such poor cows in all Egypt. The lean and wretched cows devoured the 7 fat cows, but when they had devoured them, it was impossible to tell, for they looked as wretched as ever." That's Pharaoh's dream. That's what Joseph was tasked to interpret. Now, what's important here, and what's not mentioned in the Bible, is that these cows came up out of the Nile. That's not explained in the Bible. But from this connection we've made now between the story of Joseph and Egyptian history and archaeology, we can explain the reason now for the cause of the famine. Now, you all know about Nile inundations. Every year in the late spring, the Nile floods its banks. Waters come down the river Nile from Ethiopia, from the Blue Nile and the White Nile, and they flood the Egyptian plain up to the desert plateau. And this happens regularly every year. But the level that it comes to is very crucial to whether or not Egypt prospers or whether it starves. And what we have down in Upper Egypt, this is Nubia here, there's Abu Simbel, there's Aswan. We come right the way down here to the border of Egypt in this period before we get to the land of Kush, which is in Sudan. We have 2 forts either side of a gorge. One is called Semna and the other one is called Kuma. Here's an aerial photograph of those 2 forts, there and there. And what happened was, in this particular period, in the reign of Amenemhat III, they started to record the heights of the Nile in the inundation, year by year. First time it had happened, they hadn't done it before. And we believe what it was an early warning system to tell people further north how high the flood was going to be. And if I show you a very complicated chart, I'll explain it very quickly. This is the low level of the river for most of the year. This is the standard flood level in modern times. That means the last 2,000 years here. But in this time, in the reign of Amenemhat, we see these records here, and they tell us that the flood jumped from 12 meters up to around 18 meters in year 3 of the king. And then suddenly, a few years later, it zooms up to 21 meters. So we have a massive increase in water coming into the Nile. This is 4 times the typical average flood, 4 times the quantity. So this is your 7 years of plenty, and that is your 7 years of famine. Plenty because increased water here to this perfect level means more harvest because you can expose more areas to water inundation and the fertile silt. Here, destruction, total destruction. Villages wiped out, cattle killed, drowned, sheep drowned. And the important thing is, if this land is flooded with 4 times the water, it takes 4 times as long for the water to dissipate out to the Mediterranean. So you can't plant your crops. Because when it comes for the end of the season, when you need to plant your seed in the ground is waterlogged. And if it happens year after year after year after year, you get a famine. That's why the cows came out of the river Nile in Pharaoh's dream. The Nile is the cause of both the plenty and the famine. This is the water conditions that they would have been confronted with at the time of planting. So in Genesis 45:6, for this is the 2nd year of the famine. There has been famine in the country, and there are still 5 years to come without ploughing or harvest. Now, if the famine had been caused by a drought, that would not stop ploughing. The only thing that stops ploughing is water. So what does Joseph do about it? Well, he's a genius, this man. This is the great Fayum Lake, and this is what it looks like today. It's called Birket Karun. This is a huge lake. In the time of Joseph and Pharaoh Amenemhat, it was this size. Absolutely enormous. Why did it grow so big? Well, because of this canal that was dug from the Nile to siphon off 50% of the floodwater into this sump, to take away the potential for disaster further north. So he devised this canal, or somebody devised this canal, to divert 50% of the water. King Amenemhat was so pleased with this operation, he actually built his pyramid right on this canal at Tawara. He regarded this as the most important thing that had been achieved in his reign. And the name of the canal? Bar Yosef, the waterway of Joseph. So Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has given you knowledge of all this, there can be no one as intelligent and as wise as you. You shall be my chancellor, which means vizier, and all my people shall respect your orders. Only the throne shall set me above you, the 2nd most important person in the land. So what do you do with the 2nd most important person in the land? Well, as he gets older, you pension him off with a beautiful house in the land of Goshen, and you can say, you can retire here with your children and your grandchildren and be blessed. You've done your duty for the kingdom, and now you can relax and take it easy. Now, unfortunately, we don't hear much about that in the Bible until Joseph's on his deathbed, where he gathers together the brethren and he tells them, I'm not going to be here for much longer, and I know that one day you will leave Egypt and you will go to the promised land. You make sure you take my body with you. You be sure, you promise me now that you'll take my body with you. So let's find Joseph in the land of Goshen. We start with Jacob, because in the famine, in the 2nd year, Joseph arranges for Jacob and his family to come and settle in the land of Goshen. And in this field, Jacob built a house. This is the reconstruction from the movie of Jacob's house. It's what we call a Mittelsaal house, which is the earliest form of the so-called 4-roomed house or Israelite house. If I put a plan up, you can see that it's basically an open room or courtyard surrounded by other rooms here. These are possibly for animals to be kept in this area, but the main part of the house was this here, Mittelsaal house. It comes from North Syria, this design. It comes from the area where the patriarchs originated. This is the type of house you would expect a patriarch to build in Egypt. And of course, Jacob was a patriarch. And then, after a while, that house, according to the archaeology, was knocked down. The owner of the house had died, and it was decided to build a palace on top of it. And this is the floor of the palace that was excavated by the Austrians. What you see here is a mud brick floor which was painted white, and then you have the settings here for 2 stone bases for wooden columns to hold it up. It was basically a very, very nice audience chamber, and I'm going to show you the reconstruction from the movie again now of that Egyptian-style palace, but it wasn't built for an Egyptian, it was built for a Semite. Possibly the vizier, the northern vizier. When we look at a plan, this part over here was added later. The original facade was here, along here, and this courtyard was added later, including these 2 suites here, and a new entrance here. But the original part of the house was this here. This is the shot you just saw of the 4 column bases and the mud brick floor. This was the audience chamber to receive visitors. This was his personal washroom, and this is probably his robing room here. And this, believe it or not, was his bedroom. And this is a mud brick platform, which is the biggest bed ever found in the ancient world. You would expect that for Joseph, wouldn't you? The guy who interpreted dreams, to have the best bed in the world. Now, what struck me immediately about this, and by the way, these 2 suites are identical. How many sons did Joseph have? So when they were growing up and were getting their first wife, he built 2 apartments for them, exactly the same. No arguing. You can't have a bigger one than him. You must both have the same size apartment. And, significantly, the original facade of Joseph's palace had, you guessed it, 12 columns, representing the 12 brothers, 12 tribes. In the back garden, and this is now the palace over here, this is the model that the Austrian excavators built for the palace. You'll see a series of tombs, and I suppose you're already ahead of me. There are 12 of them. 12 main tombs, subsidiary ones, possibly for wives here, but 12 main ones. Each one had a tree planted in front of it. But you'll notice number 12 is rather different to the rest. Number 12 is a pyramid tomb. Here you see that pyramid tomb at the back of the garden, dated at the same time as the palace here. The ones that you see along the line here, and these ones are slightly earlier. By the way, those daggers that I showed you earlier on came from these tombs. Now that pyramid tomb is what we're going to concentrate on now. This is the photograph before they started to excavate down into the tomb. What you see here is a platform made of mud brick, and then on the front a base for a chapel. So you have a pyramid with a chapel in front of it. As I say, they haven't started excavating, and now the plan of it looks like this. Here's your platform base for the pyramid, here's your chapel, and underground, underneath the pyramid, we have a mud brick vault where the burial took place. I'll explain what that is in a minute. Here they are digging down into the burial chamber, and this is all they found inside. A few broken bits of limestone, and that strange thing. I'll show you the excavation of the actual tomb itself. Here we see this man in the blue galabeah standing in the corner of the tomb. That's the chapel over there. There's the fragments of limestone and this large group of heavier limestone here. That is what we're going to concentrate on in a minute. And looking in the other direction, here is that object again, looking from the chapel towards the burial chamber. And in the burial chamber, all you've got is this piece of limestone and 2 more pieces of limestone from the same object. Completely empty. No bones, no mummy beads, no coffin wood, no pottery. Absolutely empty. So the archaeologists said, oh, I know why that is. Because there's a tunnel that's been dug in from the chapel into the burial chamber, and everything has been cleaned out. But then I asked BTAC, what grave robber would take the bones? What's the value of the bones to a grave robber? It doesn't work. This is not robbery. This is removal, pious removal of the body. So now the crunch time is, what is this? Well, it stood in the chapel in front of the tomb. And when they assembled the bits, it was quite clear that it was part of a human statue, the top half. But you'll notice that the whole of the face has been smashed off. This is reconstruction here. The eyes have been gouged out with an axe. Look at this massive hit on the top of the head there. But we also have a throw stick on the shoulder. Well, I'll come back to that in a minute. If we look at the hair, beautifully coiffured, beautifully combed, and the original paint still survives on this statue, red hair, flame red hair. And on the forehead, although you can't see it too well, this is yellow paint. So yellow skin, red hair, beautifully coiffured and combed, in what we call the mushrooms hairstyle. And on his shoulder, a throw stick. Now, a throw stick is a symbol of an Asiatic or Semite. So this high official with this statue is an official of state, but he's a foreigner. He's not an Egyptian. On the back shoulder, I began to see, can you see, fragments of paint in stripes. See that one? Can you see them coming in this direction here or on the shoulders, the collar, and then they go down vertically? If I highlight that for you, just a little bit, just to help you to understand it. It's a multicolored coat. So this statue, which is twice life size, seated statue, of a high official of state with yellow skin, red hair, wearing a multicolored coat in a tomb, a pyramid tomb. Now, a pyramid tomb is normally not given to a high official. In this period, only kings had pyramids. Only kings had colossal statues. No individual other than a king would have that. This guy has been honored to the highest level that a king could grant. Art historians have looked at this statue and said that it was carved and made in the royal workshops next to the pyramid of Amenemhat III. Okay, so the king ordered this statue for this individual. So let's restore his face. Red hair, yellow skin, collar, multicolored coat. And this is the reconstruction from the movie of the chapel with the statue. And if only we had the other part of this, we'd be able to read the name of the individual. And this is his name in hieroglyphs, and that's the name of Joseph in his Egyptian name. This Joseph character was a genius, an absolute genius. He was in charge of pretty much everything in the land. One of the things he was due to organize was the mining of turquoise in Sinai. And this genius man, who was trained to read the hieroglyphs, write the hieroglyphs, but also being a Semite, came up with something quite extraordinary at a place called Sarabat el-Kadim, which is the main turquoise mine in Sinai, which is up the top of this mountain. I'll do this very quickly. You climb up to the heights in the middle of Sinai, and you arrive at a temple here, right on the top of the mountain. This is the temple of Hathor, who is the lady of turquoise, the goddess of the turquoise mines. These stelae are all dedicated to her, and they have Semitic names on them of the workforce that was sent here to mine the turquoise. Here is Hathor, the goddess with the strange wig and the eyes, and she's called Hathor. And here we have Meket Mofkat, which is the Lady of Turquoise, which is her title. Here is one of the mines where they excavated the turquoise, and what Petrie found, Flinders Petrie found in here, was quite remarkable. He found a script carved on the mine face. And it's clearly hieroglyphics, but nobody could read it. It didn't read Egyptian. So Petrie was scratching his head and couldn't work it out. And then Sir Alan Gardner came along and worked out what was going on here. And he realized that it was actually Hebrew, but written in hieroglyphs. And it's called Proto-Sinaitic. So here is your Hebrew alphabet with the earliest form of writing. So what happens, for instance, I'll give you an example here. The water sign in Egyptian hieroglyphs is the word for nu, water, but in Hebrew it's mayim. So that becomes the letter M. The house, Beit, Egyptian pair. Okay, so brilliantly, he takes Egyptian hieroglyphic signs, he actually gives the Hebrew name to them, and the first letter of the Hebrew name becomes the letter of the alphabet. And it can go all the way through the alphabet, right the way down to Tav, which of course is the cross. And this one over here, Aleph, which is the ox. Let me give you an inscription from there, which you can read just about if I highlight it. This says, Mem Aleph Ayin Mem. It's a very crude form of the word Mayim, and that is a leather water bag. Water. Let's look at the letter Aleph just to show you how that evolves into the modern alphabet. Here is our modern letter A. You can do this with all the letters of our alphabet. This is it in Phoenician, rotated 90 degrees with the cross member breaking through the diagonals. And this is it in Proto-Sinaitic from this particular cave. And if I now put the details in, it's an ox, Aleph. So we get our modern alphabet through Proto-Sinaitic, through Proto-Canaanite Hebrew, through Phoenician, through Greek to our modern alphabet. That's all down to Joseph. Joseph gave us our alphabet.
And the reason why you believe it's Joseph, why do you think that that's the case?
It requires it to be a Semite with a superb education, who was an administrator, who could write in hieroglyphs, but wanted to develop a script for writing Hebrew. Now, I would have originally thought of Moses, but we now find that these inscriptions are dated to the late 12th dynasty, which is before Moses. So it has to be somebody else. And the only person I can think of capable of doing that was the man who was the most important official in the land of the pharaohs, the vizier, capable of doing all this, who was a Semite, who lived in that palace in the eastern delta. It's logical to assume that it must be Joseph who did this. So I'll get on to Moses very quickly. Who was the pharaoh who raised Moses in the palace? So here's the text, famous one from Exodus 1. Then there came to power in Egypt a new king who did not know Joseph. Joseph had died. Look, he said to his people, the Israelites are now more numerous and stronger than we are because they've prospered. We must take action to stop them from multiplying. Or if war should break out, they might join forces with our enemies. They might take up arms against us and then escape from the country. Accordingly, they put taskmasters over the Israelites to wear them down by forced labor. This is the introduction to Moses and his birth. They've prospered, they've got numerous, they've become powerful, and we've seen that because in the 13th dynasty, most of the officials were Semitic. They weren't Egyptians. In fact, even some of the pharaohs were Semitic at that time. One of the most telling and saddest things about the archaeological excavations at Tel Adaba Avaris is they found hundreds of tiny graves. These are mud bricks here, so that's a little baby. All over the site. Now, in most ancient sites, infant burials represent around 25% of the cemetery population. In other words, 1/4 of most graves you find in the ancient world belong to infants, 1 year old or less. In this site at Avaris, infant burials represent 50% of the total cemetery population. There is a massive doubling of the number of infant burials. And then, with the remaining adult population that are left over, of the remaining adult burials, there are 3 females to every 2 males. That tells me that these infants are mostly male, because there's a skew in the population. These slaves go from being 50-50 male and female to a strong bias towards female in adulthood. And we know what that story is. Now, there is a writer, a Jewish historian called Artaparnos of probably Iranian extraction. We believe he might have been from Persia. And he actually wrote a history of the Jews for the Greek pharaohs, the Ptolemies. And his history was placed in the Alexandrian Library. Then, of course, later on the Christians came along and burnt it to the ground, and we lost his original manuscript. We've never been able to recover that. However, other people, other scholars, quoted from him extracts from his History of the Jews. And he tells us the Pharaoh who raised Moses in the palace. Even though the Bible just says Pharaoh, he names him. Now remember, he's writing in Greek for his Greek masters, the Greek pharaohs, the Ptolemies. This is what he calls the Pharaoh who raised Moses. Chenofres. Three elements. Chenofres. We can translate that back into Egyptian as Cha-Nephre or Cha-Nofre. That is the name of just two kings of ancient Egypt. One in the Old Kingdom, which doesn't count, and this guy. Ca-Nephre-Sobekot IV is one of only two kings in the entire history of Egypt with this prenomen. In other words, the coronation name. So this is the name Artaparnos gives to the pharaoh, and we can identify him with this king called Sobekot IV. Here he is. He's the most powerful pharaoh of the dynasty, the 13th dynasty. Here are statues of him from Karnak. He is the 29th ruler of the 13th dynasty. I'm very quickly going to show you his position. But he probably had a summer palace like this one at Avaris, where he would have met, or Moses would have been raised, and then perhaps in the confrontations of the Exodus, this had been the place where those confrontations would have taken place. If you look at the site again from a different angle, you can imagine, here's Pharaoh's palace and the temple. You can imagine the princess bathing in the water here, or coming out to bathe in the water here. And down here, the baby Moses being placed in his basket, and then the water taking him towards the palace where he would have been found by Pharaoh's daughter. When you get the archaeological evidence, you can start to see the story evolving and working. So Moses was then raised in the palace of Chenofres. He would have been an educated man, learning hieroglyphs, etc. Here we see a fragment of the Royal Canon of Turin, which is a king's list of the pharaohs. And here we get this last sub-dynasty that enslaved the Israelites. Sobekot III, we have a Brooklyn papyrus with slave lists with Semitic names in there. And then we have Neferhotep, a very powerful king, and Sobekot IV, who was the one who was the stepfather rather, of Moses. When he died, there's the start of the 13th dynasty. When he died at the bottom of the papyrus, the 29th king, we come to the next column over here. We need to be looking for the Pharaoh of the Exodus. So if I go 45 years down, it's approximately 45 because we don't have the exact dates, we come to this little fragment of the papyrus here and the name Dudimose. Remember that name, because he's the Pharaoh of the Exodus, not Ramesses II. This nobody. This guy who nobody's ever heard of. He's virtually the last king of the 13th dynasty. And it's his time when this happens, according to Manetho. Have you heard of Manetho? He's the Egyptian priest who wrote a history of the Egyptians, who mentions, quoted in Josephus, who mentions this. And this is quite striking. In the time of a king called Ptolemais, remember he's writing in Greek again for the Ptolemies. Ptolemais is Dudimose. In his reign, for what cause I know not, a blast of God smote us. And God here is in the singular. You would expect an Egyptian to be writing, and the gods smote us. But he doesn't. He refers to one God smiting the Egyptians. And he continues, and Kai in Greek, which means what follows on from God smiting. Unexpectedly, from the regions of the east across the Sinai, invaders of obscure race marched in confidence of victory against our land. By main force, they easily seized it without striking a blow. And having overpowered the rulers of the land, they then burned our cities ruthlessly, razed to the ground the temples of the gods, and treated all the natives with cruel hostility, massacring some and leading into slavery the wives and children of others. That is the punishment of Egypt. That is post-Exodus, the invasion of the Hyksos, coming into Egypt, being able to take over the land without striking a blow. There is no army to defend Egypt. Why? It's at the bottom of the sea. Otherwise, Egypt would have been defended by the army. And at this very moment, at the city of Avaris, Tel Daba, in stratum G1, the Austrians came across scores of pits in the ground, shallow pits, with bodies thrown in on top of each other. Look how this guy's leg lies across this guy's chest. This one is flat on his back, that one's on his stomach. Here's another example This guy has just literally been tossed into the grave and his arms fallen forward. Betak, the excavator, says what happened in Egypt at this moment was a terrible plague struck the place. And the people died. And they had to bury them in emergency burials for fear of contamination of the survivors. And right afterwards, the entire Asiatic quarter of the city vanished. They simply closed their doors and they left. And for a period, we're not too sure how long, maybe 5 years, 6 years, the place was left the drifting sand. And then in came the Hyksos and occupied the site and completely bulldozed it flat and built a mortuary cult on top of this site, where they buried the Hyksos kings. At the end of stratum G, marking the end of the 13th dynasty, the main Tell area was abruptly abandoned and the Semitic population vanished. So here we are, this is the location now we're dealing with. We're not saying Ramesses in the 19th dynasty was the pharaoh of the Exodus. We're saying it happened down there under Dudimose at the close of the 13th dynasty. And this, 40 years later, or approximately 40 years later, is when we should be looking for a Jericho that was destroyed. And then we have the Egyptian collapse with the Hyksos dominating the country for 2 centuries before the recovery in the 18th dynasty. So, we're not going to deal with where they went, because that's for the next film. So I'm going to very quickly jump forward to the conquest. And I should be able to wrap this up within the time we've got left. So remember our chart. We have the Iron Age town built by Hiel on the body of his 2 sons in the time of Ahab, circa 800 BC. Then we have, going backwards, the 600-year gap at Jericho. Then we have the destruction of the Middle Bronze Age city destroyed by Joshua.
And David, what you're saying is that this Dudimos and the end of his kingdom and the dark, or the second intermediate period, is right there. Right at that spot. The second dark age hits in right at that spot. Okay.
And it's caused by the Israelites and God destroying the Egyptians. The walls collapse at Jericho. There's heavy burning of the site, and the site is abandoned, as I say, for 600 years, just as in the biblical story. Joshua 6, 20 and 26. When the people heard the sound of the trumpet, they raised a mighty war cry, and the wall of Jericho collapsed then and there. At once the people stormed the city, each man going straight forward, and they captured the city. And at that time Joshua made them take his oath before Yahweh. Accursed before Yahweh be the man who rises up and builds this city. On his firstborn will he lay his foundations. On his youngest son he will set up its gates. Exactly as happens with Hiel in the Iron Age 1b, the new city is built and he sacrifices his 2 children as foundation deposits for the building of the new city in the time of Ahab and Omri. So if we look at Jericho, this is looking down on Jericho. Excavated in the 1950s by Kathleen Kenyon. I'm going to take you to this trench that she dug. She dug several trenches, but this is one that I studied myself. Here is the trench during the excavations. You see she dug right down into the tell. Here's me examining the stratigraphy, because when you cut down into a trench, you can see the different layers, one on top of the other. And what I'm going to show you now is the structure of the defensive system, which is a foundation of the wall that's on the top of the tell here, a sloping rampart made of plaster, a glacis we call it, at the bottom a revetment wall made of stone. And so it's virtually impossible to attack this monstrous structure, these high walls that you see at Jericho in the Middle Bronze Age. Let me put together on top of that the existing structure, which has now disappeared. So you have the revetment wall made of stone at the bottom, you have the plastered slope glacis here, and you have the city wall at the top. And when Kathleen Kenyon excavated this, she found the wall had collapsed and had rolled down and was ended up at the bottom. The mud bricks from the top wall ended up at the bottom. The walls came tumbling down. And then they set the thing alight and burnt the whole city to the ground. So again, this is the wonderful reconstruction from the movie. When the archaeologists were excavating the houses, they found large storage jars full of grain. This grain was heavily charred from burning. But what this tells us is when the attack took place, when the destruction took place, it took place shortly after Passover, because that's when the harvest is brought in from the Jordan Valley. And we know it wasn't a long siege because the jars are still full. It must have been a very short siege of the city. What does the Bible tell us? 7 days. If we move on to Hatzor, very important site, the greatest or foremost of the kingdoms according to the Bible. It was the royal citadel of a king called Jabin, who was the top knob of the area. Joshua 10:11. Joshua then turned back and captured Hatzor, putting its king, called Jabin, to the sword. Hatzor in olden days was the foremost of those kingdoms. In compliance with the curse of destruction, they put every living creature to the sword. Not a living soul was left, and Hatzor was burnt to the ground. It suffered the same fate as Jericho. There were 2 or 3 major cities that suffered the same fate. What's key for me is the name of the king that Joshua personally thrust his sword into. When they were excavating it, and they're still excavating, this is the late Bronze Age palace up here, but if you go deep, deep down below that, they exposed the corner of the Middle Bronze Age palace. This is the time when Jericho was destroyed. This is the time when Hatzor was destroyed. And in that area there, this is the corner of the building, they turned up a fragment of a tablet. In cuneiform, Akkadian, because this was the lingua franca of the region. This is how diplomats wrote to each other at this time. And this is actually a letter addressed to a king of Hatzor. And do you want to know what his name is? He's called in Canaanite Akkadian Yabni. And Yabni is biblical Jabin. So the king who lived in this palace at the Middle Bronze Age that was burnt to the ground and destroyed has the same name as the king that Joshua slaughtered and burnt the city to the ground. How specific do you want me to get? I'm going to finish now with a very, very important site, Shechem. Here is the great Migdol fortress of Shechem with a great cyclopean wall sweeping around. The temple of Baal Berith, Lord of the Covenant, the foundations are here, facing east. And in front of it, in the courtyard, this has been excavated away. It was originally all at this level. Standing in front of the temple is this big white stone. If we look at it from another angle, as I say, this has been excavated, so this is actually modern support here. It was originally all at this level. There is the temple of Baal Berith, the great Migdol temple. There is the standing stone. If I reconstruct it using the reconstruction from the movie, you get a better impression.
David, what is this near? What 2 mountains is this near?
Oh, they are called Gerizim and Nebal. Is that right? Ebal. That being Gerizim on that side. So we have the oak tree. We have the tower temple, the Migdol temple of Baal Berith, the Lord of the Covenant. We mustn't say Baal because it doesn't mean Baal, the evil Baal. This is the word for Lord in this particular case. The covenant of Abraham we're talking about here. And the standing stone. Who set the standing stone up? Joshua. So there is Joshua's standing stone in front of the temple. Still there to this day in the reconstruction I'll show you later. Sometime later, about 100 years later or so, there was a king of Shechem called Abimelech. And he was a pretty bad character. And he decided to attack the city and kill everybody in the city. And this is a reconstruction of the fire of destruction which burnt this temple to the ground. And this is the text from that. Judges 9:45-49. All that day Abimelech attacked the town. He stormed it and slaughtered the people inside, razed the town and sowed it with salt. On hearing this, all the leading men inside Migdol Shechem took refuge in the crypt of the temple of Baal Berith. Abimelech's men piled branches over the crypt and set it on fire over those who were inside, so that all the people in Migdol Shechem died, about 1,000 men and women. And what does archaeology show us? That this temple was destroyed by fire about 100 years later, exactly matching the story in the Bible, the book of Judges. So, this monolith here is one of the most important artifacts from the Bible. Joshua 24, 25, 28. That day, Joshua made a covenant for the people. He laid down a statute and ordinance for them at Shechem. Joshua wrote these words in the book of the law of Yahweh. He then took a large stone and set it up there under the oak tree in Yahweh's sanctuary. Joshua then dismissed the people, everyone to his own heritage. This was the renewal of the covenant, and that is the covenant stone of Joshua. If you go to Nablus today, ancient Shechem, you see that standing there, stone daubed in Intifada graffiti by the youths, and then painted over in yellow paint to cover what they've written on it. Standing there forlorn, not recognized by anybody. The Israelis don't recognize it. The archaeologists don't recognize it for what it is. It's so obvious what it is, but of course, it's 300 years too early to be Joshua's standing stone. So it can't be. Neither can that be the temple which Abimelech destroyed and burnt to the ground. So, let's look at our wall of time one more time. Now, when we didn't have any matches over here, in the 19th dynasty or the 18th dynasty, suddenly we have a perfect match between the arrival of Joseph and Jacob in the Middle Kingdom towards the end of the 12th dynasty. The growth and multiplication of the city of Avaris so it becomes one of the biggest cities in the ancient world, teeming with Semitic peoples. Suddenly a slavery comes along. A change of dynasty happens where you get this sub-dynasty of major strong pharaohs who are native Egyptians who decide to enslave the population. We see it in the bones of the burials. We see it in the children, the infants that are buried, the massive increase in the burial of infants. And then we see the death pits at Avaris. And suddenly the whole population of Semites leaves the city and disappears. And then immediately following that, the Hyksos arrive, invade Egypt, and literally take over the place for 2 centuries, brutalizing the Egyptians. And finally, 40 years afterwards, in the Middle Bronze Age here in Canaan, we have a destruction of Jericho, where the walls fell down, where the city was burnt to the ground, and was abandoned for 600 years, where Jabin was killed at Hatzor, where the site of Shiloh was founded for the ark for the very first time, and where at Shechem we find the covenant stone of Joshua erected by the leader of the Israelite tribes. I don't know how I can make it more factual than that. I don't see how anybody could ignore that evidence. I really don't. But that's what we have, and that's the fight we've got to fight, because the evidence is there. It's now a case of persuading everybody to look seriously at this model, because it gives us the answers we've been looking for. Thank you.